Item: the 4th of March, 1818, one deed of conveyance, Latin, rendered fair into English for Mr. Hetherington, attorney, of Dogpole, Shrewsbury, 3 sheets, at 2 shillings the sheet, 6 shillings. Item: the 11th of March, one exemplification of a recovery, Latin, 4 sheets, 8 shillings. Item: the 19th of March, extracts from a parish register, Latin and English mixed, 2 sheets, 4 shillings. Item: the 2nd of April, one abstract of title, 7 sheets, 14 shillings, with a further shilling allowed for the candles, the work having been wanted in haste. So ran the ledger, in a narrow upright hand, page after page, year after year, and the hand was not a clerk's hand, for no clerk in Shrewsbury kept his ledger with such patience, and no clerk in Shrewsbury wrote a Latin abstract that the attorneys of 3 counties asked for by name. The hand belonged to a woman. Her name was Theodosia Wynne, and she was 30 years of age, and she earned her bread by copying and by rendering out of Latin the deeds, wills, recoveries, fines, and muniments of other people's fortunes, in a lodging of 2 rooms above a stationer's shop in the town of Shrewsbury, where the river Severn goes round the hill in a great horseshoe, and the bells of St. Alkmund's and St. Julian's answer one another over the roofs. She had been at this work 9 years. Her father had been a clergyman in the south of the county, a scholar of the old patient kind, who had taught his only child her grammar out of Lily as though she had been a son bound for Oxford, and then her Ovid, and then her Horace, and then, when his eyes began to fail, had made her his eyes, so that by 17 she read the Fathers to him in the evening, and construed the hard passages without slowing. He used to lean back with his hand over his face and say, not to her but to the room, that the girl construed like her great-grandfather, which was the highest thing he knew how to say of anybody. He died when she was 21, of a winter on the chest, leaving her his books, his blessing, and an income of £11 a year from a legacy soundly invested. And the books and the blessing proved the better part. She did not go for a governess, though 2 families would have had her. She had observed what a governess's life was, and she had asked herself, in her plain practical way, what she possessed that the market wanted and no governess could supply. And the answer was Latin. Attorneys must have Latin dealt with every week of their lives. Old deeds, old fines, old copies of court roll. And half of them had forgotten theirs, and the other half had never had any to forget. And so she had gone to Mr. Hetherington of Dogpole, who had been her father's man of business in a modest way, and had offered herself for the work. And he had tried her on a bundle of fee-offments that had defeated his clerk, and she had returned them rendered fair in 4 days, with a note upon a doubtful boundary that saved his client an action at law. From that week she never wanted employment. It was not a fortune. It was independence which she valued above a fortune. Her 2 rooms were her own. Her hours were her own. Her tea was her own, bought £1/4 by £1/4, and on the shelf above her working table, wrapped in a sheet of cartridge paper against the dust, lay the one piece of work she did for nobody's fee, a translation, begun the winter after her father died and carried forward a few lines at a time in the hour before bed, of the epistles of Horace, whom her father had loved above every author for his good sense and his good temper, and whom she loved because loving him was the last conversation she could still hold with her father. She had rendered the first book entire, and was deep in the second. She showed it to no one. When the day's copying was flat and mercenary, a mortgage, a schedule of debts, she would tell herself, in the evening there is Horace, and that hour was to her what a garden is to some women, and a glass of wine to some men. This was the whole of her history until the 8th of May, 1818, on which day, a Friday, the boy from Dogpole brought up word that Mr. Hetherington begged Miss Wynne would step down to him at her convenience, and that she would oblige him by bringing her Latin with her, which was his manner of joking, for her Latin went where she went, as another woman's thimble does. She found him at his table with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead and a tin dispatch box open before him, and in the box a parchment folded, sealed at the fold with 3 seals in black wax, and docketed on the back in a hand that made her look twice, for it was an upright, narrow hand uncommonly like her own. Mr. Hetherington was turned of 60, dry, kind under the dryness, in a snuff-colored coat. He had known her since she was a child on her father's arm, and he did not begin, as he began with other business, by clearing his throat. He said, "Miss Wynne, I have here a will. It is in Latin, which is an eccentricity in a will made in the late reign, but the testatrix was, I am given to understand, an eccentric lady. It comes to me from Mr. Raysbury of Ludlow, who is named in it as executor, with a request that it be rendered exactly into English by a person competent and discreet, and I know but one such person." He did not hold the parchment out at once. He turned it in his hands, and he said, "Before you begin, I am to tell you 2 things, and I am to tell them in this order. For so Mr. Raysbury's letter instructs me, and his letter is particular. The first thing is this, that the testatrix is dead, that she died on the 2nd of February last at her house in the southwest of this county, and that she was buried, by her own direction, without any monument but a flat stone bearing her name and her years. The second thing," said Mr. Hetherington, and here he laid the parchment down on the green cloth of the table and pushed it across to her with one finger, "is that the copyist is named in the body of the instrument, and Mr. Raysbury desires that she should learn in what capacity from the Latin itself, and from no other mouth." For a moment, Theodosia did not touch it. It is a strange thing to be told that a document knows your name before you know its contents, and she was aware of her own heart, not racing, but making itself felt, like a step on a stair in an empty house. Then she drew the parchment to her, and broke nothing, for the seals at the fold had been lifted already by the executor, and opened it, and read the first line. And the first line said, in a fine engrossing hand, and in the Latin of the schools, "In the name of God, Amen. I, Deborah Kynaston, spinster, of Wistanhope Hall in the parish of Wistanhope in the county of Salop, being sound in mind and understanding, though in body weak and mindful of the shortness of days, do make and declare this my last will and testament in manner and form following." Theodosia read it twice. Kynaston. Her mother's mother had been born Kynaston. This she knew as one knows a fact of no consequence. A name on a mourning ring she had sold in a hard year to a jeweler in Weil Cop. A name her mother had mentioned seldom, and her grandmother, whom she could not remember, never at all. She looked up and found Mr. Hetherington watching her with the expression of a man who has kept a secret 4 days and found it heavy. "Did you know her, sir?" she asked. "I never had that honor," he said. "Mr. Raysbury knew her 30 years. I am told she was the last Kynaston of Wistanhope, of a line that has sat in the Clun Valley since before printing, and I am told the hall is old and the estate sound and unencumbered. 1,100 acres or thereabouts, farms, woods, water, and the advowson of the parish church into the bargain. Read on, Miss Wynne. You read faster than I can tell it." So she read on, translating in her head from habit the pious preamble, the direction touching the flat stone, A legacy of £50 to the housekeeper, by name Mrs. Tetlow, with the testatrix's thanks for 21 years of honest keys. A legacy of £30 to the steward, Mr. Bickerton, that hath farmed my land better than I could scold him to. £10 to the curate of Wiston Hope for the poor of the parish. A shilling apiece to the bell ringers to ring one plain peal, and no muffled peal, upon the day of my burial. For I have had silence enough in my life. Mourning gowns to the 2 maids, and then, without any change in the engrossing hand, the words she was to carry all her days. All the rest and residue of my estate, real and personal, my hall of Wiston Hope with its lands, rents, woods, waters, and appurtenances, my books, my papers, my plate, and my moneys, I give, devise, and bequeath to Theodosia Wynne, of the town of Shrewsbury, spinster, only child of the late Reverend Edward Wynne, and of Maria his wife, which Maria was the only child of my sister Alicia, which Theodosia Wynne I have never spoken with in this life, though I have these 9 years read her hand upon parchment, it being the trade of that excellent person to render the Latin of dead men into the English of living ones, wherein, as Mr. Hetherington's clients can testify, she hath not her equal in 3 counties, and I desire that she, who hath so long kept the muniments of strangers, may find some interest in keeping her own. She sat with her finger under the line for a long moment. The clock on Mr. Hetherington's mantel, which lost 2 minutes a week and had done so for as long as she had known the room, ticked through the silence, and out in Dogpole a carter was arguing with somebody about a wheel. She was aware of these things with the particularity that comes when the mind declines, for its own protection, to look straight at the one great thing in front of it. Then she said, in a voice that surprised her by being her ordinary voice, "Sir, is the instrument proved?" "Proved in the proper court a fortnight since," said Mr. Hetherington, and no caveat entered. "It is not a question, Miss Wynne, it is a fact. You are, I have the pleasure to tell you, the owner of Wiston Hope, and Mr. Raysbury desires to wait upon you at your earliest convenience, and I desire, if an old man may say so much, that your father had lived to see what his Latin has brought his daughter, though I query whether anything in the county would have persuaded him it was not the Latin itself he was proud of." She asked her one question then, the question she had been turning since the word sister. "Why did I never hear of her?" she said. "My mother spoke of her grandmother's family perhaps twice in my hearing, and of a great-aunt not once. Was there a quarrel?" Mr. Hetherington took his spectacles down and polished them, which she had learned long ago was his way of buying time honestly. "There was," he said, "but I have it at third hand and 50 years' distance, and I will not retail at third hand what touched a lady's heart. Mr. Raysbury may know more. What I know is this, that Miss Deborah Kynaston quitted her family young, that she never married, that she kept her own counsel and her own estate for half a century, and that in the last 9 years of her life she bought, through my office and always through an agency, so that her name should nowhere appear, every considerable piece of Latin work that a certain copyist in Shrewsbury ever rendered." Theodosia looked at him. "The abstract of the Merrington title," he said, "the Ludford Register extracts, the great Fiaffment bundle in the year 16, that you sat up 3 nights over, all hers or half hers, wherever her agent could put a commission in your way without showing his principal, he did it these 9 years on standing instructions that the work was to be paid at the best rate and never hurried, and one fair copy in every case to be sent down to Wiston Hope." "Madam," said Mr. Hetherington, rising and making her, for the first time in 9 years, a bow that was not ironical, "you have had one client above all others, and you never knew her name, and she, I conceive, knew everything of yours that a hand on paper can tell. It was thus that Theodosia Wynne learned that she had corresponded for 9 years, in the strangest one-sided fashion in the world, with a great aunt she had never seen, that the old woman in the Clun Valley had been reading her as one reads a face, patiently, line by line, and had liked what she read well enough to give her everything, and that the flat stone at Wistanhope, with nothing on it but a name and 2 dates, covered the last person alive who could have told her why. Mr. Raysbury came up from Ludlow on the Tuesday following. He proved to be a spare gentleman near 70, in black, with gold-rimmed spectacles, and the stillness of a man who has spent his life hearing things he may not repeat. And he brought with him a probate copy of the will, an inventory, a schedule of the rents, and a ring with 3 keys on it, 1 great and 2 little. He went through the business with her point by point across her own working table, she having declined, with civility, to be waited on anywhere grander. And if the arrangement amused him, he did not show it, except that at the end, closing his portfolio, he observed that the testatrix had said Miss Wynne would receive him over her own ink bottle, and had said it with satisfaction. The estate, he told her, was clear. 1,140 acres, 6 farms let to good tenants, the home farm in hand under Mr. Bickerton, timber in the long wood worth more than the rental if it were ever cut, which the testatrix's instruction was that it should not be, except for the repair of the hall and the cottages, and in the funds after the legacies and the charges, a sum of £4,200. The hall itself was of grey stone, part of it very old, with a later front, 17 hearths counted for the old tax, a library of which he would say nothing except that she would find it sufficient, this with the ghost of dry humour, and a muniment room over the porch, of which the great key on the ring was the key. The 2 little keys, he said, belonged to a chest within that room, an iron-bound chest of the old fashion, and touching that chest he had a direction to deliver in the testatrix's own words and no others. He unfolded a paper and read, in the level voice of his profession, "Tell her the chest is not estate business. Tell her the deeds and the court rolls lie in the presses on the north wall, all in order, and Mr. Raysbury hath abstracts of everything material. The chest is family business, and it will keep, and she is to open it when she has been at Wistanhope 1 month, and not before, for I will have her know the house before she knows me, the house being the honester witness of the 2. Mr. Raysbury folded the paper again and gave it to her. "She is dead," he said, "and you may of course open what is yours the first hour you stand in the room. But I served her 30 years, and I never knew her ask a thing without a reason, and I would counsel you to indulge her in this last one." "I intend to," said Theodosia. He looked at her then over the gold rims, a long look, and something in the dry old face gave a little, like frost in sun. "Yes," he said, "I begin to see what she saw." The remove was soon made. A woman who owns 2 rooms' furniture, 4 boxes of books, and a wrapped parcel of Horace does not linger over her packing, and Mr. Hetherington, who insisted on the honor of managing the carriage of the books himself, was heard to tell his clerk that the office was losing its right hand and the county its best abstract, and that he hoped Providence understood its own business, for the law in Shrewsbury would now go to the dogs. On the 18th of May she took the coach south, and then the Bishop's Castle Road, with Mr. Raysbury beside her in a hired chaise, through a country that climbed and greened and narrowed until the hedges gave way to grey walls and hanging woods, and the air smelled of bracken and running water. The Clun Valley in the 3rd week of May is as green a place as England keeps. They came to Wystan Hope at 5 in the afternoon, the sun still high over the western ridge that is Wales, and the hall stood at the valley's turning with its back to a hanging oak wood and its face to the water meadows. Grey stone gone silver gold in the light, mullioned windows, tall chimneys of a twisted brick, and over the porch a single carved shield so weathered that the arms on it had gone back to stone. The gates stood open. On the gravel, before the door, the household waited, as custom required, and it was not a great household. Mrs. Tetlow, the housekeeper, upright in black bombazine with her chatelaine, a woman of 60 with a face that had decided long ago to be just before it was anything else, her daughter Prue, 20, round-cheeked, in a print gown, frightened of the moment, and visibly determined not to be. The two maids, old Speak, who was called the butler by courtesy and had been the testatrix's manservant 40 years, bent as a thorn on a west hedge, and with eyes still as blue as March, and, standing a little apart as one who belonged to the land rather than the house, Mr. Bickerton the steward, square, weathered, 50. Turning his hat in his hands as though it were a wheel, he was checking for soundness. Theodosia stepped down from the chaise, and there was a moment before anybody spoke, in which she looked up at the house and the house looked down at her, and the rooks went over from the wood, and she understood, with a clearness that was almost pain, that every person present had loved the dead woman and was measuring the stranger against her. And she did the wisest thing she could have done, though she did it from no policy but only because it was true. She said, "I never knew her, and you all did, and I find I envy you." Mrs. Tetlow's chin came up, and something behind her eyes unbolted a door. "If you please, madam," she said, "there is tea laid in the south parlor, and my mistress's orders were that you should have the blue bedchamber that has the morning sun, and that the first evening you were not to be troubled with the books, nor the papers, nor anything but your dinner." "Her orders, madam, ran to 3 pages, said Mrs. Tetlow, "and the first line of them is, she is to be comfortable before she is anything else." She woke the first morning at 5:30 before the house, as she had waked for 9 years to make the most of the light that costs nothing, and lay a moment hearing an unfamiliar England outside the glass. Rooks, running water, a shepherd somewhere speaking to a dog in Welsh, and then she rose and dressed and let herself out by the garden door into a world smoking with May mist, and walked, without having decided to, down the lime walk and through the wicket into the churchyard, and found it at once, on the south side, in the mown grass by her family's railed tombs. The newest stone and the humblest, flat, gray, already faintly greening at the edges, with cut into it a name and 2 dates, and not one word more. Deborah Kynaston, 1738, 1818, and she stood by it a long while as the mist thinned, until the sun cleared the eastern ridge and came across the valley and laid itself down the length of the stone like a hand, and she found that she had nothing to say that was fit to say aloud yet, not knowing the person, only the handwriting. So she said, at last, the only thing that was wholly true, which was, "Madam, I have come. I will learn the rest," and went back through the wicket and up the lime walk, and met on the way Mrs. Tetlow, shawled and out early on the same errand, or on the errand of watching over hers, neither of them ever said which, and the 2 women walked up to the hall together in the new sun, saying nothing at all, and were friends from that half-mile, in the way that is settled without treaty and never afterward disturbed. The first weeks were a slow learning of the house, and the house repaid learning. It was a building that had grown rather than been built, a hall of the old sort with a screen's passage and a great chamber, a Jacobean stair with strawberry leaves on the newels, floors that sloped like a gentle sea, and everywhere the marks of a long, frugal, intelligent keeping. Nothing showy, nothing new. Everything sound. The roofs tight, the walls dry, the great water butt by the kitchen new hooped. The library filled the whole south wing above the parlor, 2 rooms thrown into one in the last century, and when Theodosia first stood in the middle of it, she laughed aloud, alone, for the first time since her father died, at the pure justice of the word sufficient. 3,000 volumes if there was one, the classics in a body along the east wall, the folio fathers her father had owned in octavo, a plant in Horace, a shelf of manuscript sermons, the county histories, and, on a stand by the south window where the light fell best, a great church Bible, and by the fireplace a deep-worn chair with a stool beside it that had plainly held one person's books and one person's cup through 10,000 evenings, and she could not have said why the sight of that stool moved her more than the stone in the churchyard had. But it did. She walked the estate with Mr. Bickerton, who tried her for a fortnight with short answers, and then, finding that she asked what a thing cost, and listened to what he said, and did not pretend to knowledge she had not, opened like a barn door. She went over the household books with Mrs. Tetlow, and found them kept to a farthing. She stood godmother, before she had been 3 weeks in the parish, to a carter's daughter, the curate, Misty. Haberley, a stooped young man with a north country burr, having asked her in a rush of courage outside the church porch, and the parish having taken note, in its unhurried way, that the new lady said yes, as though she had been done an honor. On the Sunday after her arrival she went to church at St. Milburga's, where the Kynaston pews were 3 deep and dark with age, and sat through Mr. Haberley's sermon under the painted memorial of a Kynaston dead at Naseby, and heard her own surname read out in the bidding prayer as patron of the living, and bore it. Of her great aunt she gathered, in these weeks, what a house tells of its mistress, that she rose at 6 all her life, and was in the library by 7, that she spoke Welsh enough to scold and to comfort, and used both across the border hills where her farthest sheep-walks ran, that she had a temper in her youth, so said old Speak, like the Clun in flood, and had spent 50 years quietly building weirs against it, and in her age was gentle as an evening. That every winter she taught, herself, in the hall kitchen, any child of the parish that wished to read, and that once a quarter there had come to her, by carrier from Shrewsbury, a flat parcel wrapped in cartridge paper, which she would carry to the library and open alone, and that on those evenings, said Prue, who had carried in the candles, the mistress would be found with the new sheets spread on the long table, reading them with a lens, and sometimes she would say, to nobody, look how she carries the sense over the line, or she has caught the old man's trick of the ablative, look you, exactly right. And once, near the end, Prue had heard her say, clear as a bell in the empty room, well, sister, your side of the family could always write, whatever else they could not do. The month was out on the 18th of June, and on the morning of the 19th Theodosia took the great key and the 2 little keys, and went up the newel stair over the porch to the muniment room. But it is necessary, before the chest is opened, to say what had come to the door 2 days earlier, for on the 17th of June, while she was in the walled garden with Mrs. Tetlow among the gooseberries, a carriage had come up the valley road, a glossy dark carriage with arms on the panel, and had stood before the hall a quarter of an hour, and gone away again, and the card that was brought out to her on a salver, when she came in with her basket. Read, Sir Goderic Kynaston, and below the name, in a sloped confident hand, these words, in pencil. A kinsman calls to pay his respects, and will do himself the honor of calling again when the hall is in a way to receive him. Mrs. Tetlow, reading the card over her shoulder without apology, made a sound in her throat that Theodosia had not heard from her before, and said, "Madam, that man was not over this threshold 3 times in my 21 years, and the last time my mistress had the horses put to before he had been an hour in the house, and drove herself to Ludlow in the rain, to Mr. Raysbury. And what she said to Mr. Raysbury I never knew, but what she said to me, giving me the man's hat with her own hands, was, 'Tetlow, if ever I die and that person comes here smiling, send for the lawyer before you send for the blacks.'" Theodosia turned the card over twice, put it in her pocket, and wrote to Mr. Raysbury that evening, and it was in the shadow of that card, 2 mornings later, that she climbed to the muniment room with the 3 keys. The room was low and stone-floored, lit by the window over the porch, and it smelled of leather and iron and time. Along the north wall stood the presses Mr. Raysbury had promised, and she opened them and found the estate's whole memory in order. The court rolls in their canvas sleeves, the deeds tied in ferret and docketed in the upright narrow hand, 300 years of Wiston-Hopey filed like a good conscience, and against the west wall, under the window's slant light, the chest. It was of oak, black with age, bound in iron, the length of a settle, with 2 locks, and the 2 little keys turned sweetly, as though someone had oiled the wards not long ago, thinking ahead, as she had thought ahead about everything. Theodosia lifted the lid and knelt down before it, and was there yet reading, when Prue came up anxious at 2 in the afternoon. But what was in the chest belongs a little later in this history, because what was in it cannot be understood without Sir Goderic, and Sir Goderic did not wait to be understood. He returned on the 23rd of June, at noon, announced this time, and was received in the south parlour, and he proved to be a man of 55, dressed 10 years younger, fleshy, high-coloured, scented, and a primrose waistcoat and a coat from London, with a quizzing glass on a black ribbon which he raised, on entering, not toward his hostess, but toward the 2 Kynaston portraits over the chimney-piece, as though checking the plate at an inn against the bill. He was of the Chester Kynastons, he explained, seating himself without quite being asked, grandson of old Roger Kynaston's 2nd son, in fine, and he smiled a smile that came and went like something switched, the male heir of this ancient house, and, as his advisers read the matter, its owner. "Madam," he said, spreading his hands as one deprecating his own reasonableness, "believe me, nobody deplores this awkwardness more than I. You have been the innocent instrument of an old woman's whimsy. She was, God rest her, past 80. The will, I am instructed, is in Latin, which of itself, one might say, speaks to a certain wandering of the faculties, and it seeks to carry an estate which, madam, cannot be carried by will at all, for Wiston-Hope is entailed, strictly entailed, upon the heirs male of the body of Thomas Kynaston, who died in the reign of King William. I have the deed. My grandfather had it of his father. I do not ask you to take my word. My counsel, Mr. Pringle of Lincoln's Inn, will wait upon your man of business with a copy, and my proposal, for I wish to be liberal, is that you shall have your legacies and your costs and a year to make your arrangements, and that we shall part. He smiled again, cousins. Theodosia had sat still through the whole of this, her hands in her lap, and those who knew her ways would have remarked that her stillness had a quality it wore over Latin, when a construction did not parse and she was waiting, without temper, to find out why. She said, "Sir Goderic, you say there is a deed of entail. Of what date?" He waved the quizzing glass. "Of the last century's end, my people have the particulars. The 20th of June, 1696, if you will have the very day. And it has lain, she said, with your family in Chester these 120 years, and was never once produced, though this estate passed by will twice in that time, to my great-aunt's father, and to my great-aunt herself. Sir Godric's color deepened a half-tone. Families are negligent, madam. Papers sleep in boxes. It has been found. That is the material point, and Mr. Pringle is sanguine, entirely sanguine. I am sure he is, said Theodosia, and rose, which obliged him to rise. Sir, this is a matter for the lawyers, and I will not play at law over the tea things. Your counsel will find Mr. Raysbury at Ludlow. But I will say one thing to you, as it seems we are to be adversaries, and I would rather be a plain one. You called my great-aunt's Latin the wandering of her faculties. Sir, I have read her will in the original. It is not the Latin of a wandering mind. It is the Latin of a mind like a frost in April, and if your deed is what you say it is, its Latin will bear reading too, and I give you notice, I shall read it. For the space of a breath something looked out of Sir Godric's comfortable face that was neither comfort nor confidence, and looked at her and calculated, and then the smile switched on, and he made his bow, and said he asked nothing better, madam, nothing better in the world, and was carried away down the valley behind his glossy horses, leaving in the parlor a smell of scent and a silence like the silence after a plate is dropped. Mrs. Tetlow, who had stood by the door throughout on the thinnest of household pretexts, permitted herself one sentence. Madam, she said, my mistress would have liked that about the frost. The copy of the deed came to Ludlow in the first week of July, and Mr. Raysbury brought it out to Wistonhope himself, with his own Latin clerk's rendering beside it, and a face longer than she had yet seen him wear. It is, he said on its face, a strict settlement of the estate, made on the marriage of Thomas Kynaston's eldest son, parchment of the right age to the eye, a fair engrossing hand of the period, the seals plausible, witnessed by names that belong to the neighborhood and the time. If it is genuine, madam, I will not disguise it from you. The entail was never barred. The male line takes, and our will, which I drew and believe in as I believe in the church catechism, carries the personal estate, the money and the goods, and nothing else. The hall and the land would go to that person. He said that person with the exact intonation of a man declining to spend an adjective. And is it genuine? Said Theodosia. Mr. Raysbury took off his spectacles. My clerk, he said, has been through the rendering twice. The law of it is right. The form of it is right. A settlement of that age should recite, convey, and limit, much as this recites, conveys, and limits. There is nothing in the substance I can lay hold of. And yet, madam, I served the lady 30 years, and she was not negligent, and her father was not negligent, and neither of them ever heard one whisper of an entail out of Chester. And when a document sleeps 120 years and wakes up the very summer 1,100 acres want an heir male, I am an old man, and I have seen paper do many things, but I have never seen it time its waking so well. He put the parchment copy on the long library table between them. The original, he said, they will be obliged to produce. Mr. Pringle proposes a meeting at Ludlow at the month's end. Before matters go further, to exhibit it, he is confident to the point of insolence, which in a man of his standing troubles me more than the parchment does. Madam, I will retain what counsel you please, and we will fight it up to the Lords, if you bid me. But I am bound to tell you that if that deed stands, the law is his. Theodosia stood a while at the south window, looking down the valley her great-aunt had looked down for 50 years. The hay going up the meadows in the July heat, the river running its silver thread, the sheep on the far Welsh hills like grains of rice, and she found that what she felt was not chiefly fear, though fear was in it. It was the feeling she had when a construction would not parse. "Sir," she said, "leave me the copy. Both columns, the Latin and your clerk's English." Mr. Raysbury looked at her, and a dry light came into his eye. "The lady's own words," he said, were, "the house is the honester witness, but she also said to me once, Raysbury, when a thing is wrong on parchment, it is wrong in a place a lawyer does not look, for the lawyer reads what the words do, and my niece, mark me, my niece will read what the words are. Madam, she left you more than the hall. I begin to think she left you the war." He went back to Ludlow in the cool of the evening, and Theodosia Wynne carried the copy to the library and lit the working candles her great-aunt's economy had always allowed to that room without stint, and sat down at the long table where the flat parcels from Shrewsbury had been opened each quarter for 9 years, and spread the deed before her, and sharpened 3 pencils, and began at the beginning with the words "this indenture," to read what the words were. She read that night until the candles were low, and the next day, and the day after, not anxiously, but in the way she did everything of this kind. A line at a time, the pencil moving, the doubtful words listed on a separate sheet with their places noted, and to the household, which knew by now from cellar to attic what hung over the house. There was something in the sight of the lamp burning late in the south wing that steadied everybody, as a light in a window steadies a traveler, though nobody could have said what precisely the new lady was doing up there. Only that old Speak put it about, with satisfaction, that the mistress, so he already called her, was at the Latin, and that in his experience of the family, which was longer than anybody's, when a Kynaston woman was at the Latin, somebody somewhere would presently wish she were not. For 2 days the deed held together. The recitals were right, the conveyance to uses was right, the limitation to the first and other sons in tail male was right, and the remainders were right, and even the little vanities of a 17th century engrossing clerk were right, the long S's, the doubled consonants, the flourish on the capital T. Whoever had made this parchment, if made it was, had been no bungler. He had had a genuine settlement of the age before him, for a pattern, that was certain, and he had followed his pattern like a good journeyman, and by the second evening Theodosia had begun to keep, on her separate sheet, a second column, headed not errors, but habits, in which she noted, as her father had taught her to note in any hand she meant to know, the scribe's unthinking customs, how he abbreviated, where he broke his lines, which words he never troubled to shorten. And it was there, in the habits, that the thread first showed. For the clerk of this deed, 16 times in 3 skins of parchment, wrote the county's name in full, Salopia, in the ablative in Salopia, comitatu Salopii, smoothly, uniformly, proudly. And Theodosia sat back in her chair and looked at that smooth uniformity for a long minute, and then went down the library ladder and along the east wall and took out the boxes of her own 9 years of renderings, the fair copies that had come home to Wistonhope each quarter, fee-offments, fines, recoveries, extracts, 40 years, 80 years, 140 years old. Every parchment of this county that had passed under her lens since she was 21, and she began to check, document by dated document, one plain question: how did real clerks, in real deeds, write the name of this county? And the answer in every instrument she possessed earlier than about the year 1740 was that they did not write it so. They wrote Salop with a stroke over it, the old abbreviation, Com-Salop, in Com-Salop. The full-blown Salopia of the schoolbooks belonged to a later, tidier, more self-conscious age, A clerk of King William's reign wrote the short form as unthinkingly as he breathed, and the clerk of Sir Godric's deed had never once breathed that way in 3 skins. It was not proof. A scholar might argue an exceptional clerk. But it was the first wrong grain in the wood, and having found one she now knew the workman could err, and she went back to the beginning with her lens and her lists, no longer asking is this right, which is the reader's question, but where else were you careless, which is the examiner's. And on the 4th evening, in the testimonium clause, the deed answered her. In cuis rei testimonium ran the parchment, the parties aforesaid to these present indentures interchangeably have set their hands and seals, the 20th day of June, in the 8th year of the reign of our sovereign Lord and Lady William and Mary, by the grace of God of England, Scotland, France and Ireland, King and Queen, defenders of the faith, Anno Domini 1696. She read it and read it again, and became very still, and then she rose and fetched, from the shelf of county histories, the volume with the tables of the reigns, though she scarcely needed it. For any hand that has docketed 40 years of dated deeds carries the tables in its fingers, and she verified what she already knew, that Queen Mary II died upon the 28th of December in the year 1694, that from that day forward King William reigned alone, that every authentic instrument dated after that December styles him singly William III, by the grace of God King, and gives his regnal year alone, and that no clerk in England, in June of 1696, 18 months after the Queen was in her vault at Westminster, could have written our sovereign Lord and Lady William and Mary, King and Queen, except a clerk who was not writing in 1696 at all, but long afterward, with a pattern deed of the early 1690s open before him, copying its royal style verbatim, and forgetting to let the poor Queen die. The forger had taken his model from the wrong side of December. The parchment might be old, the hand might be fair, the seals might be anybody's grandfather's, but the words were impossible, as flatly impossible as a letter dated at Waterloo and mentioning the peace. The deed proclaimed its own falsehood in its most solemn clause, in the very sentence meant to swear to its truth, and it had needed only one reader in 120 years. Wait, she thought, with a cold clearness, no. It had needed only one reader in 1 year, for the thing was new. It had waked, because it had only just been born. And somewhere in Chester or in London a workman of real skill was trusting, as such workmen must always trust, that no one who mattered would ever truly read what he had written, because for 100 years past the men who decided such matters read renderings, abstracts, and effects, and the Latin itself had become a dead wall that every eye slid down, every eye but hers. She sat alone in the ring of candlelight, with her finger on the impossible words, and she said aloud, in the empty library, to a woman 4 months under a flat stone, "Thank you, Aunt. I see why it had to be in Latin. You were making sure of your reader." Then she wrote to Mr. Raysbury. She wrote 3 pages, setting out the regnal style, the tables, the salopia habit, and 2 lesser stumbles she had since gathered in her lists. A phrase of the conveyancing pattern books of the 1760s that no clerk of the 1690s used, and a witness's name spelled in a fashion the parish register of that family, which she possessed in her own old extracts, never once employed, and Mr. Raysbury read the letter twice in his office at Ludlow, and then, so his clerk long afterward reported, did a thing he had not been known to do in that office in 30 years. He laughed. One short bark, like a fox in November, and struck the table with his open hand, and said, "Get me Mr. Pringle's confident direction, for we will have that meeting, and we will have it soon, and, boy, when you are old, remember you copied the letter. The lady has taken their deed by the one part a lawyer never reads, the part where it prays God to witness it, and God, it appears, has declined. The meeting was fixed for the 31st of July, at Mr. Raysbury's chambers in Broad Street, Ludlow, and it is a measure of the confidence of the other side that Mr. Pringle came down from London in person, and brought Sir Goderic with him, glossy carriage, primrose waistcoat and all, and brought also, in a japanned box carried by a clerk as though it held a relic, the original deed. Mr. Raysbury, for his part, had asked leave to have present his client, Miss Wynne, and, for form's sake, a gentleman of the neighborhood as a friend of the family, and there attended accordingly, seated a little back from the table and saying for a long time nothing at all. A tall grave man of 38 in a plain dark riding coat, whom Sir Goderic, glancing once and finding neither wig nor gown, dismissed as some squire brought to make wait, and whom this history must presently introduce with more care, for it was the first day that Theodosia Wynne and the Duke of Estcourt sat in one room. The business opened with civilities and moved to confidence. Mr. Pringle, a smooth, heavy man with a voice like furniture polish, laid out his client's descent, exhibited his attested pedigree, and came, with the air of a conjurer arriving at the good part, to the deed itself, which the clerk lifted from the japanned box and spread with cotton gloves upon Mr. Raysbury's table, weighting its corners with 4 round leads. "There, madam and gentlemen," said Mr. Pringle, "is the settlement of Wistonhope, and I am instructed to say that while my client's tenderness for a kinswoman's situation remains what it was, his patience is not eternal, and the liberal terms offered in June will not be offered in September." Mr. Raysbury looked at the parchment without touching it, and asked, mildly, whether Mr. Pringle's side would object to the instrument being read. "Read," said Mr. Pringle. "Aloud," said Mr. Raysbury. "We are all friends to accuracy here, and my client, as it happens, reads the hand and the tongue with some facility, and, madam, would you oblige us?" What followed was remembered in Broad Street for 30 years, and improved, no doubt, in the remembering, but the substance is beyond dispute, for 4 lawyers' clerks were in the room. Theodosia Wynne rose, and came round the table, and put on, with a deliberation that ought to have warned somebody, her father's spectacles, which she used for close work, and she read the deed aloud, in the Latin, from the top, in a clear schoolroom voice, translating as she went, clause by clause, as fluently as another woman reads a newspaper, and the reading had 2 effects. The first was upon Sir Goderic, who had plainly never heard the thing read, and who listened for a while with the complacency of a man hearing his own money counted, and then with a creeping stiffness, as it came home to him by degrees that of all the people in the room, the one to whom this parchment was most transparent was the woman it was made to ruin. The second effect was in the reading itself, for she read the recitals, and the parties, and the conveyance, and the limitations, all smooth, all fair, and then she came to the testimonium clause, and she stopped translating, and read the Latin of it twice, the second time very slowly, the way a mother reads out the sum a schoolboy has got wrong, giving every syllable room to be heard. And then she took off the spectacles, and looked, not at Mr. Pringle, but at the clerk with the cotton gloves, who was the one man on that side of the table who knew the trade, and she said gently, "Who dated this for you?" "In the 8th year of the reign of our sovereign Lord and Lady, William and Mary, King and Queen, and Anno Domini 1696. Sir, the Queen died in December of 984. In June of 986 there was no lady, there was no in Mary, There was no king and queen in this realm, nor in any clerk's testimonium from Berwick to the Land's End. There was King William III, alone, in the 8th year of his reign alone, and every attorney's boy in England knew it then, as every attorney's boy knows it now, because his bread depended on it. Your deed, sir, is dated in a reign that had ceased to exist. It mourns the Queen a year and a half too late. The silence that came down on that room was of the kind that has a texture. Mr. Pringle was on his feet by instinct, saying, with polish gone from the voice, that the observation was curious, was ingenious, was a matter for experts in any case, and not to be snatched at across a table, and Mr. Raysbury said in his level way that nothing had been snatched. The words were on the parchment where they had been these 120 years, or these 18 months, whichever it should prove, and experts could read a regnal year as well as a lady. Better, no doubt. And would. And Theodosia, still gently, offered Mr. Pringle her further list, the 16 proud Salopius, where a true clerk's hand would have breathed salop, the phrase out of a pattern book printed when George II was king, the witness's name spelled as that family never spelled it in their own register, and she laid her sheets before him with the pencil columns squared, errors on the left, habits on the right, dated and referenced like an abstract of title, which is what they were, an abstract of the title of a lie. Sir Goderic said nothing at all for a long minute. Then he began, in a high voice, to say that he had been given the deed, that his people in Chester, that a box in a muniment room, that his late uncle and Mr. Pringle put a hand on his client's sleeve, the immemorial gesture, and Sir Goderic's voice went out like a dip in a drought, and Mr. Pringle gathered his papers, and the clerk folded the parchment away with his cotton gloves, handling it, Theodosia observed, already a little differently, as one handles a thing whose price is changed, and Mr. Pringle said that he would take his client's further instructions, and that the meeting need detain nobody longer. And within the fortnight Mr. Raysbury received a letter proposing, without one word of concession, that in a spirit of family peace all claims under the alleged settlement should be withdrawn, each side bearing its own costs, and within the month it was known through 2 counties, in the manner in which such things are known though no one tells them, that Sir Goderic Kynaston had gone abroad for his health, that his establishment in Chester was reduced, and that a certain skilful scrivener of that city had likewise, and rather suddenly, found the heir of the continent necessary to him. Mr. Raysbury, advising submission to the proposal and an end of it, permitted himself one flourish in his covering letter. Madam, he wrote, in 50 years of practice I have watched estates saved by juries, by precedents, by the deaths of adversaries, and once by a flood that drowned an assize. I have never before watched an estate saved by the date of a queen's funeral. Your great-aunt chose her heir as she did everything else, with her eyes open. I remain, madam, with a respect I do not scatter, your obedient, humble servant. And so, by the last week of August, the war was over that had never quite become a war, and the valley, which had held its breath through hay harvest, let it out through corn harvest. And at the harvest supper in the great barn at Michaelmas, when the fiddler played and the long tables steamed, Mr. Bickerton the steward stood up, glass in hand, redder than the fire warranted, and proposed the health of the mistress in a speech of 11 words, which was for him an oration, this being the whole of it. She read them out of it. Neighbors. The same as her aunt would, and the barn came down about her in such a storm of stamping and shouting that the fiddler's dog fled into the night, and was not seen till morning, and Theodosia Wynne, standing in her place with her hand at her throat, discovered that it is possible to be entirely calm through the danger, and to weep at the deliverance, and let them see it, and was loved in that valley from that evening in a way that deeds cannot convey nor entails limit, entail general, forever. It is time to say what was in the chest. She had opened it, as has been told, on the 19th of June, in the very shadow of Sir Godric's card, and had knelt on the muniment room floor from morning till Prue came at 2. And this is what the iron-bound chest of the old-fashioned held, in order as she lifted it out. First on the top, a letter superscribed to my niece, in the upright narrow hand, sealed with the 3 seals in black wax. Second, beneath it, wrapped in soft leather, a miniature of 2 girls painted about the year 1760, one perhaps 18 and dark, one perhaps 15 and fair, cheek almost to cheek, the dark one's arm around the fair one's shoulders, and on the back, in faded ink, Deborah and Alicia Kynaston, and then, in the same hand but blacker, later ink, one line of Latin, which Theodosia rendered before she knew she was doing it, and had to set the miniature down. The line was, "Love is not conquered, but it is very often mislaid." Third, a packet of letters, 41 of them, tied in a black ribbon, all sealed, all unopened, all superscribed in the upright hand to Mrs. Alicia Wynne. At first to an address in Bath, then to an address in Bristol, then to no address at all, only the name, and across the earliest, in another hand, coarse and long dried, 2 words, returned unread. Fourth, a schoolgirl's exercise book of the old century, the marbled cover worn to the pasteboard, and inside, in 2 hands alternating page by page, one the upright narrow hand young and unformed, one rounder and lazier and sweeter, the epistles of Horace, Englished by 2 sisters, with a title page drawn in berry ink and decorated with an owl, and beneath the owl, the first book of the letters of Q, Horatius Flaccus, done into English by the Mrs. Kynaston of Wistanhope, because Papa says no one else in this county ever will. Fifth and last, filling the whole bottom of the chest, in flat parcels of cartridge paper each docketed with a quarter and a year, 9 years of Theodosia's own fair copies, every sheet she had ever sent unknowing down that valley. And on the topmost parcel, in the upright hand grown frail, as though the writer had known which parcel would lie uppermost when the chest was opened, a single docket line, the collected works of my dear niece, being the only letters she ever wrote me. She read the sealed letter last, kneeling there on the stone floor, and because everything in this history that matters hangs from it, it shall be given nearly whole. My dear niece, it began, if you are reading this, you have been a month at Wistanhope, and you will have understood by now that I was proud, and you will shortly understand that I was also a coward, and I would have you learn both from me and not from the county. When I was 23, and my sister Alicia was 20, we quarreled. You will wish to know the cause, and here is the sting of my confession. The cause would not fill a thimble. Our father intended me for a neighbor's son, a good man whom I did not love. I refused him. There were words in this house of the kind that leave marks on paneling, and in the middle of those words my sister, who was frightened and who loved peace and who was 20, took our father's part for one evening. One evening, niece. By morning she was sorry, and by the next spring she was married to your grandfather and gone south, and had written me 11 letters. And I, who had won my war and kept my liberty and my Latin and my valley, I did not answer the first letter because my hurt was dear to me, and I did not answer the second because I had not answered the first, and so on, my dear. For a lifetime there is no other machinery in it. Pride needs none. It is a wheel that turns by itself. When she died, Your mother, who knew only that the sisters did not write, sent me word out of duty, and I sat down that day and wrote to her, your mother, the letter I had owed her mother 40 years. And it was returned to me, unread, with 2 words on it, by someone in that household I never learned whose loyalty to my sister was better than my deserts. And I said, very well, and there is the whole coldness of me in those 2 syllables. I said, very well, and I bought a black gown, and I went on. Now attend, for here you enter. 9 years ago, Mr. Hetherington of Shrewsbury, seeking Latin help upon a matter of mine, and knowing nothing of any kinship, for the world had long forgotten it, sent me certain sheets rendered by a young person of that town. And I read half a page, and the room was suddenly 40 years younger. For it was our hand, niece, the hand our father taught us both, alive on new paper. And I made inquiry, and learned your name, and your father's name, and your mother's, and I understood that Providence, which I had defied so long, had sent my sister's granddaughter to earn her bread by the very trade 2 girls once played at under this roof, because Papa said no one else in this county ever would. I ought then to have written. I know it. You are asking, over this letter, why did the old woman not simply write? And, my dear, I answer you with the exactness you will value above tenderness, because pride sets like mortar, and because a coward with one thing left dares not stake it, and the one thing I had left was this, that so long as I never asked, I could not be refused. So I chose the coward's way, which I do not commend to you, but which I will not lie about. I read you for 9 years as scholars read, at a distance, in the text, and everything I needed to know was there. I know your patience by your ligatures, which never once in 9 years went slack on a 4th page. I know your honesty by the Merrington abstract, where you noted against your own client's interest the flaw in the boundary, because it was true. I know your pity by the register extracts of the plague year at Ludford, where beneath the burials of one terrible October week you wrote, in pencil, in the margin, not for your employer, for no employer wants it, but for the dead, because someone should, the ages of the children. I sat one whole evening over that pencil margin, niece, and when I rose from it, my will was made in my head, and there has never been 1 hour's wavering since. As to the estate, Wraysbury has everything and Bickerton is honest. Keep the Longwood standing and the schooling in the kitchen going, and never sell land to buy money, for it is buying dinner with the table. As to the man who will come smiling, and he will come, I have left you no instruction. First, because instruction cannot be given for such, and second, because, having now read you 9 years, I am serenely certain, and I write this smiling, an old woman alone at this long table where you will sit, that you are more than a match for anything that travels behind glossy horses. And as to the exercise book you have found in this chest, I finished the first book of the letters the winter after my sister left, alone, both hands mine, and it was the loneliest paper I ever blacked. And if it should ever happen, my dear, that you have carried forward any Horace of your own, and I think you have, for our blood does not change, then I ask of you the only thing this whole inheritance asks. Take the book down to the library and set your sheets beside our sheets, and let the 2 translations lie on one table at last, and so the work will be finished in the 3rd generation that was broken in the 1st, and a quarrel that outlived 2 sisters will be outlived in its turn by a book, which is, I have found, the way of books and the mercy of them. Your loving aunt, Deborah Kynaston. Written at Wiston Hope, in the January of the year she died, being the last thing but one she ever wrote. The last thing of all, missed, Raysbury told her afterward, had been a note to himself about the mending of the church stove, that the poor should not sit cold at the February sacrament, which, said Mr. Raysbury, was the woman entire, in a dozen words, and Theodosia thought so too. What does a woman do with 41 unopened letters addressed to a grandmother she never knew? Theodosia did not open them all at once. She took them as her great-aunt had taken her, a little at a quarter, one letter on a Sunday evening, in the deep chair by the library fire with the stool at her knee. And so, through the autumn and winter of that year, a week at a time, she heard a proud, lonely voice tell its fair sister about lambing storms and library purchases and the great comet, about a curate's wedding and a bad harvest and a good one, about nothing, about everything. Each letter beginning without ever a reproach, my dear Alicia, and each one ending, and I am as I was, your Deb. And if some of those Sunday evenings ended with the reader's cheek against the worn arm of the chair as though it were a shoulder, there was no one to see it but the fire, and the fire kept its counsel as the fires of that house had learned to do. But this is running ahead, for between the harvest supper and those winter Sundays there enters, at last and properly, the tall, grave man in the plain riding coat, and he must be given his due, having waited in a corner of the Ludlow chapter of this history with a patience that was, as it proved, the whole key to his character. Hugh, 5th Duke of Estcourt, was 38 in that year. His seat, Estcourt Castle, stood above the Thames some 12 miles east of Wistanhope, an hour and a half's ride by the river road, and the county, which loved him steadily and saw him seldom, would tell a stranger 3 things about him. That he had buried his wife 6 years before, within a 12-month of the wedding, of a fever, and had worn something quenched about him since, and no other attachment ever whispered of. That he was the best judge of a horse and of a tenant in the west of England, sat lightly on his rank, went about with 1 groom, and had refused the Lord Lieutenancy twice, because, he said, the county had abler men, and he had a library to catalogue, and that the library was not a phrase, that the Estcourt collection, begun by his great-grandfather, was among the finest in private hands between Oxford and the sea, and that the present Duke, who had been a scholar at Christ Church until his elder brother's death, fetched him home to the title he had never expected nor much wanted, was the first of his line who could read every book he owned. What the county did not know, and Theodosia learned from Mr. Raysbury on the drive back from Ludlow itself, was that the Duke and Miss Deborah Kynaston had corresponded for 11 years, that it had begun with a courteous dispute about a reading in Heiress, conducted through a bookseller in Ludlow, before either knew the other's name, that they had met in the flesh exactly 4 times in those 11 years, by mutual and entirely satisfied consent, the aunt observing that a correspondent improved by distance is spoiled by dinner, and that in the January before she died she had written him 1 last letter, which he had shown to no one, and which had contained, besides the return of a borrowed reading of the 17th epistle, 1 sentence that he was to carry through the events above related and long past them. Mr. Raysbury knew of the sentence only because the Duke, asking leave to attend at Broad Street as a friend of the family, had read it to him by way of credentials, holding the letter, said Mr. Raysbury, as a man holds something that is either precious or a light, or both. The sentence was this: "When I am gone, your grace, there will come to Wistanhope a person who construes better than I do. Though I have never told her so, and you are not to, she is my heir, she does not know it, and I ask of your grace, who are the only neighbor I have ever met whose Latin and whose conduct are both sound, the one favor I have asked of any man these 30 years, that if smiling persons should trouble her, You will do nothing whatever, for she will not need it, but that you will be there. And see her win, for a victory with no witness is a dinner eaten alone, and I have eaten too many. He had done exactly, and characteristically, what the letter asked, nothing whatever. He had sat back from the table in Broad Street through the whole of that morning, with his arms folded and his hat on his knee, and had not spoken 6 sentences, but Theodosia, whose trade was reading, had been aware of him as one is aware of a fire in a room at one's back, and once, at the moment when she asked the clerk in cotton gloves who dated this for you, she had heard from that corner a single sharp breath taken and held. The sound a man makes at the exact instant a long shot strikes the mark, and when the meeting broke and Mr. Pringle's carriage was heard to go, the tall man had risen and asked Mr. Raysbury, in a voice pitched for the room and not for her, whether he might be presented, and had bowed to her precisely as men bow at court, and had said only, "Madam, I had a letter from your aunt in January which I find I am at last able to answer, and I would ask leave to answer it at Wistanhope, when your hay and your lawyers permit," and had gone away, leaving her to discover from Mr. Raysbury in the chaise, item by item like an abstract, everything that has just been set down. He came to Wistanhope in the first week of September, riding the river road with his one groom, and bringing in his saddlebags, wrapped in oiled silk, the 3 volumes of the aunt's Plantain Horace which she had lent him in the spring of her death, each with her paper markers still standing in the pages like little grave flags. And the first thing he did, being shown into the library where Theodosia received him, was to cross to the east wall, find the gap on the shelf by memory, and put the volumes home with 2 hands, gently, the way a man lays something down that he has carried a distance. And the second thing he did was to stand a moment before the long table, on which there lay, side by side that morning as they had lain since June, a worn marbled exercise book open at a page in 2 young hands, and a plain paper wrapped quire open at the same epistle in a third. And he read for a while, silently, moving only his eyes from the one English to the other, the sister's to hers, and then said, less to his hostess than to the room, in the tone of a man conceding a wager he is glad to lose, "She told me the county would never see it done, and here it is done twice over. And this, though neither of them knew it then, was the beginning of one of the 2 or 3 great bibliographical friendships of that county's history, and of a good deal more. The friendship went forward through the autumn on the soundest of all foundations. Work, the Duke was cataloguing. His great-grandfather's collection had outgrown 3 catalogues and defeated 2 librarians. And there was besides, at the castle, a cabinet of manuscripts, deeds, letters patent, monastic fragments from the dissolved priories of the border, which no one now living had properly read. And here was a neighbor, 12 miles by the river road, who read such things as other people read invitations. The proposal of business was made with a formality that did not quite hide its eagerness, and accepted with a formality that did not quite hide hers. Terms were gravely negotiated, Theodosia declining to give her labor for nothing, with the same plainness with which she had once quoted 2 shillings the sheet to Mr. Hetherington, and the Duke conceding professional payment with the private observation, reported by the Dowager his mother long afterward at a wedding breakfast, that he would have offered the half of escort sooner than let the arrangement fail over guineas. Through October and November, accordingly, 1 day a week, the Wistanhope gig went east along the Teme in the morning mist, with Prue up beside her mistress for propriety, Mrs. Tetlow having views on that head which admitted of no debate, and in the long gallery at Estcourt at 2 tables set, after the first day, no longer at opposite ends of the room, but no nearer than the width of a hearth, The Duke and the fair copyist of Dogpull worked through the cabinet drawer by drawer, she reading and rendering, he docketing and comparing, and their talk, which began inside the drawers, priories, popes, the price of vellum, got out of the drawers by degrees, as talk over work will, and walked about the borders of 2 guarded lives, and looked over the fences, and came back each time having seen a little more. He learned, not by asking, that she had refused 2 comfortable governess situations at 21 for the sake of a freedom that had some winters run very cold. She learned, not by asking, that the quenched thing the county saw in him was not altogether grief, but grief compounded, in the way of an honest mind, with a guilt no confessor could have found matter in, that he had married at 30 as a duke marries, suitably, kindly, without the great feeling, and that his wife had died before either had had time to grow the love they had both quietly assumed would come with the seasons, and that he carried, more heavily than any man need, the sense of a debt discovered only when payment had become impossible. This he told her on the one day of that autumn that the work stopped, an afternoon in late November, when the first snow shut the light down early, and the gallery fire held the 2 tables in one ring, and he told it steadily, at the hearth, to the fire chiefly, in the manner of a man determined to be accurate about the worst of himself, and when he had done, Theodosia, who had learned mercy in a pencil margin, did not console him, which he would have minded, but said, after a proper silence, Your Grace, my aunt kept 41 letters sealed, because she would not risk a second no, and you have kept 1 question sealed, 6 years, I think, for the same reason, and the question is, whether a man who did no wrong may be forgiven for feeling that he did, and since the only person who could answer it cannot, you have appointed yourself her judgment and given yourself none. It is bad law, Your Grace, and worse Latin, for you have construed a whole life out of 1 clause. The Duke of Estcourt looked at her for a long moment across the firelight, and something that had stood shut in his face for 6 years unbolted, as a door does, without noise, and he said, at last, in a voice not quite his own, Madam, your aunt wrote me once that you construed better than she did, and charged me never to tell you. I find I cannot keep faith with the dead at the price of injustice to the living. And it was after that afternoon that the county began, in its unhurried way, to talk, for the one groom talked to the castle kitchen, and the castle kitchen talked to the mill. And what they said, which was no more than that his Grace had laughed twice at the 2 tables before Christmas, was for Estcourt news of a comet. The Dowager Duchess came down to the castle for Christmas, small, sharp-eyed, 70, wrapped in gray furs, ostensibly for the season, actually, as she informed her son within the hour with the directness that was her only surviving vanity to inspect the Latin lady, and the inspection took place at Estcourt on St. Stephen's Day, and lasted 4 hours, and concerned, on its face, nothing but a disputed genealogy of the Kynastons of the elder line, which the Dowager, a herald's granddaughter, had brought down in her own hand as a pretext, and defended with entire insincerity for the pleasure of seeing how the stranger fought, and Theodosia, who understood within 10 minutes precisely what was toward, since she had been examined before, though never by an examiner in gray furs, fought fair, gave ground where the Dowager was right, stood ground where she was wrong, and once, at the crux, produced from memory the impossible regnal date of a charter the Dowager was relying on, and proved her point with it, and then, seeing where the blow had landed, added gravely that the error was in every printed pedigree, and had deceived better scholars than either of them, which was true, and was also mercy, and the Dowager Duchess of Estcourt drove home through the dusk in high contentment, and said to her son at supper, in the voice of a woman closing a file, Hugh, I came to see whether she wanted your rank, and I find she does not want it even enough. You will have to be worth marrying on your own account, which will be a novelty for a duke. And, my dear, the last woman in this island who corrected a date against me was your great-aunt Kynaston's friend, and I have missed it, I find, for 11 years. The winter set in hard after Twelfth Night, and it was a fortnight into the new year, 1819, before the river road was open again, and something had changed in the long gallery. As both of them knew, the work went on. The cabinet was nearly done, but the talk had stopped walking round the fences, because it had arrived, and there was only one field left, and both of them knew what was planted there, and neither of them would trample it before its season. He was a deliberate man who had been wrong once by going too easily where the world pointed. She was a deliberate woman whose whole fortune had come to her from a soul that lost 50 years by refusing to risk a no. And these two deliberatenesses sat across one hearth through the lengthening evenings of February, catalogue sheets between them, each waiting upon the other's peace, in a silence that was not empty, but ripening, of which Prue, knitting in her window corner, reported to her mother only, "They do be very slow," and Mrs. Tetlow answered, "Out of 21 years of that family's service, child, in this valley the best of everything is slow. The oaks, the cheese, and the loving, and the quick sorts blow down, sour, and part." It was in that February, before the thaw, that the county contrived at last to see them in one room. At the winter assembly at Ludlow, which the mistress of Wistonhope had declined the year before, being then in her first mourning for a great-aunt she had never met and would not pretend otherwise, and which she could not gracefully decline twice, and the assembly rooms in Broad Street, 2 doors from the chambers where she had read a queen out of a deed, were fuller that night than the oldest subscriber could remember them. For it had gone about, in the way such things go, that his Grace of Estcourt had bespoken the evening free of engagements, and the county came to watch as the Romans came to the circus, though it dressed better and pretended it had come for the negus. She wore the dove gray silk that would afterward be her wedding gown, and her aunt's garnets, and no plume, in an age of plumes, which the dowagers along the wall noted before she was 3 steps past the door, some with disdain and the shrewder with a kind of respect. For a woman who will not wave a feather at a coronet is either very sure or very indifferent, and neither is matter for comfortable gossip, and there occurred in the first hour the incident of Lady Bracewood, which the county still tells. Lady Bracewood was the relict of a baronet from the Severn side, handsome, loud, and disappointed. Having 2 daughters unbestowed and a theory, aired for 6 years wherever cards were played, that Estcourt must marry again and need only be shown the right room. And she bore down upon the newcomer by the tea-table under full sail, and said, at a pitch nicely judged to reach the surrounding squadrons, "So this is the famous Latin lady. You must find our assemblies sadly frivolous, Miss Wynne. After your parchments, I am told you were bred a copying clerk." The room within earshot stopped breathing. Theodosia set down her cup and considered the question with the same unhurried attention she gave a doubtful ablative, and answered, at exactly the same pitch, "No, madam, not bred one, for my father was a clergyman and bred me to books. But I made myself one at 21, when the choice lay between copying at 2 shillings the sheet and dependence at any price offered, and I have thought well of my trade ever since, for it taught me the 2 things the assemblies teach slowest, that what is written outlasts what is said, and that a fair hand shows fairest when the matter is someone else's. And she said it without 1 degree of heat, and took up her cup again, and an old gentleman by the fire, a justice of 40 years who had buried 3 wives and feared nothing in the county but his own cook, laughed out loud, one great crack like river ice going, and said, "Madam, you may copy that into every commonplace book in this room." And Lady Bracewood found the far door good for her health. And the Duke of Estcourt, who had entered in time to hear the whole of it, and had made no smallest motion to intervene, which every matron present marked, and only the dowager afterward correctly construed, crossed the room at his leisure, and asked Miss Wynne for the honor of the 2 first dances. They danced twice, which committed nothing, and then, which committed everything, did not dance again, but sat out the rest of the evening in the bow window over Broad Street, with a branch of candles and the assembly's whole attention decently pretending to be elsewhere, talking, as the county could see, though the county could not hear. And what they were talking of, in fact, was so far from gallantry that it must be recorded as a curiosity of courtship. For she had asked him, in the second dance, a question about the monastic fragments then on the tables at Estcourt, and he had begun to answer it as the music ended, and the answer had a genealogy in it, and the genealogy had a disputed abbot, and the disputed abbot carried them into the window seat, and an hour and a half past the supper bell, and when the dowager's report of the evening reached Bath, the dowager duchess read it and laid it down, and said to her companion, with deep satisfaction, an hour and a half on a dead abbot in a lighted window with the county watching, my dear, in our family. That is a declaration. The rest is conveyancing. It was likewise in that late winter that the Duke's sister, Lady Charlton, who must have her sentence in this history for the sake of what she did with it, came into Shropshire from her husband's place in Warwickshire, ostensibly to see her mother's portrait rehung, actually on embassy from that half of the family which had begun to be alarmed. For a duke may catalogue with whom he pleases, but the word settlement had now been heard, and Lady Charlton came, by her own later cheerful confession, prepared to find an adventuress with a quotation ready, and stayed 11 days, and spent the last 4 of them at Wistonhope of her own asking, going over the kitchen school, the quarter-day books, and the muniment room with the appetite of a clever woman, shown at last a machine that worked, and she wrote to her aunts from the blue bedchamber a letter that ended the family's alarm in 1 paragraph, of which the operative sentences were these: "You ask me what she is. I will tell you what she is. She is a woman who was left 1,100 acres by a stranger, and did not for 1 fortnight leave off earning her bread until the will was proved. Because, she told me, plans are not income. She is a woman whom the best blackguard in 3 counties tried to rob with a false deed, and who answered him by reading it better than his own lawyer, and then pensioned the forger's washing wife out of her charity rents with no name on the entry, and she is the only woman I ever met, gentle or simple, who being asked by me, in my worst aunt's voice, whether she did not find a duke a great burden for a scholar, looked at me for a moment in a way I have not been looked at since the schoolroom, and said, 'Madam, I have construed harder authors, but none I liked better, and, my dears, I came to protect Hugh, and I stay to warn you all fairly that if this marriage miscarries through any officiousness of ours, I shall be very difficult to live with, and I am accounted difficult now. It should not be supposed, because a duke has entered this history, that Wistonhope stood still to watch. An estate is a creature that must be fed daily, and its new mistress fed it. That first winter she revived, in the hall kitchen, the school her great-aunt had kept, and found she had a gift for it that surprised her, who had never taught anything but herself. 14 children came through the snow on the worst morning of January, which Mr. Haberley said was 13 more than came to church in the same weather, and he said it from the pulpit, which made the farmers laugh and then look thoughtful. She taught reading, and figures enough for market, and to the 3 quickest, because they asked the beginnings of Latin, and one of the 3 was the carter's daughter to whom she stood godmother, a black-haired burr of a child called Gwen, who by Lady Day could decline her nouns like a bailiff counting sheep, and of whom this history will have one more thing to say in its last pages. She sat her first quarter-day in the estate office beside Mr. Bickerton, the tenants coming in one by one with their rents in worn canvas bags, and heard each man's year before she took his money, which was her aunt's custom and became hers, and when the miller, a widower with a bad lease and a worse winter, came short by £11, she did not forgive the rent. For Mr. Bickerton had taught her by then that forgiven rent shames a man at every market after. But she hired him at £11 that same quarter to new floor the muniment room, so that the debt was paid in oak and nobody shamed, and the manner of the thing went round the valley quicker than the matter, as manners do. She learned the sheep walks on a rough pony, in a riding habit of her aunt's cut down, with Mr. Bickerton at her stirrup, naming every gate and gill and the failings of every ram in the border country. She learned to tell good thatch from cheap, a sound milch cow from a dressed-up one, and seasoned oak from green by the ring of it under her knuckle, and if the education of Miss Wynne of Wyston Hope in her first year would have made a thin book beside her Horace, it was written in the same hand, patiently, a line at a time, with the doubtful words listed and gone back over until they parsed. The lambing storm came at the equinox, the great gale of March 1819 that unroofed barns from Montgomery to Bridgenorth. It caught the high flock on the far walks with the shepherd's boy alone among them. His master lying at home with a broken ankle got on the ice at Candlemas, and the boy did what boys do, too much, and stayed out, and at 9 at night the wind fit to lift the slates. Word came down to the hall, and the mistress of Wyston Hope put on the dead woman's frieze cloak that still hung by the garden door, and went up the hill herself with Mr. Bickerton and Old Speak's grandson and the stable lantern, because, as she said afterward when Mrs. Tetlow scolded her white-faced at 2 a.m. over the kitchen fire, the boy was mine, and the sheep were mine, and the storm did not care whose they were. So somebody had to go who did. And they brought the boy down with the wet lambs inside their coats, all saved but 3. And the valley added the frieze cloak on the hill to the reading at Ludlow in the account it was keeping of her. And the account was closed from that night. She was no longer the new lady, she was the mistress. And the valley would have gone into the flood for her, and told her so in its own dialect, which was silence, and first fruits left at the kitchen door, and caps pulled off a half-second quicker than rank required. Sir Goderic troubles this history only once more. In the April of that year there came to Wyston Hope a letter from Boulogne, much crossed, smelling faintly of scent even after the sea, in which the writer, subscribing himself her affectionate cousin and unluckiest of men, represented that he had been cruelly practiced upon by the scrivener, that his honor was whole, though his fortune was hurt, and that a loan of £300 against his expectations would be an act of family piety she would never regret. And Theodosia read it twice, and laid it in the fire, and then, because she was her aunt's niece but not her aunt, sat down and wrote to Mr. Raysbury, instructing him to pay quarterly to the wife of the scrivener of Chester, who was left in that city with 4 children and no bread, the sum of £12 a year from the Wyston Hope charity rents, the payment to be entered as from the estate and no name mentioned. For, she wrote, The man cheated me and is punished. The woman washed his shirts and is punished worse. And my aunt taught me that a margin is where you write what the employer does not want and the dead deserve. And I count the woman among the wronged of this business, and the child in her arms cannot spell entail. Mr. Raysbury docketed the letter as he docketed everything, and wrote beneath the docket in his own hand for his successors. And this is the family, gentlemen, that a forger tried to sell for parchment. The cabinet at Estcourt was finished in the last week of April. 111 manuscripts, rendered where rendering was wanted, docketed and shelved in a new order that the Duke declared would outlast the dynasty, and with it ended the professional pretext of a year, and both of them knew it, and the following Tuesday came, which had been the working day, and no gig went east along the Teme, and Wystan Hope's mistress was found by Mrs. Tetlow that afternoon in the walled garden, weeding a bed that had no weeds in it, and Estcourt's master was observed by his butler to walk the length of the long gallery 4 times between 2 and 5, past 2 tables that nobody had yet thought proper to move, and to stop the 4th time at the smaller one, and set straight an inkstand that was straight already. And the household reports of the 2 establishments, could they have been laid side by side like translations, would have been found to agree in every material particular as true texts do. He came on the 2nd Tuesday of May, riding the river road in the early morning with no groom at all, which the castle had not known him do in 6 years, and he found her in the library, at the long table, where the 2 Horaces still lay open side by side, and Mrs. Tetlow, who admitted him, contrived to have urgent business with Prue in the linen room directly overhead, where a knot in the floorboard had been convenient to the housekeepers of Wystan Hope for 200 years, so that we have the scene entire, and the county has had it, in one form or another, ever since. He did not sit. He stood across the table from her, turning his hat once in his hands and then putting it down on Sir Godric's side of the table, as it were on the vanquished ground, and he spoke as a man speaks, who has prepared his words, and then, at the door, given the preparation away. Miss Wynne, I had not, when I rode to Ludlow last July to keep a promise to a dead friend, expected this morning. I have loved you, with what dignity I could, and with what patience your year required, since the moment you took off your spectacles in Broad Street and asked a frightened clerk, more gently than his own mother could have asked it, who dated this for you? For I saw then what your aunt had seen on paper for 9 years, that in you learning and mercy are not 2 things, but 1 thing, and I have wanted nothing since, except to be within the sound of it for the rest of my life. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have loved you steadily these 10 months, to do me the honor of becoming my wife. You have made no use of me, which the world will never believe of either of us, and I would not have you begin now. Wystan Hope is yours, and shall stay yours, settled to your sole and separate use, and your school and your quarter days and your Longwood with it. I am not offering to carry you off from your ground, madam. I am asking leave to stand on it. If your answer is no, the 2 tables in my gallery shall stand as they stand, and the Tuesdays shall be whatever you please to make them, and this question shall never be raised to trouble you again. She had put down her pen when he began, and folded her hands, and heard him through with her eyes on his face, in that stillness of hers that he had first taken at Ludlow for the stillness of the courtroom, and had learned since was the stillness of the library, which is a different and a warmer thing. And when he had done, she was silent a moment, and then she said, Your Grace, I must correct your Latin. He blinked and said, Madam, I spoke English. You spoke a settlement, she said, and rose, and came round the long table as she had once come round a table in Ludlow, and stood before him. You have limited the estate of your affections upon me with such care for my sole and separate use that you have reserved nothing to yourself but a remainder in Tuesdays. And I find the conveyance defective, your grace, for it wants the one operative clause that carries everything. And since the clause is short, and since I have waited some months for leave to engross it, I will supply it now. Hugh, I shall. And whatever else was said in the library at Wistonhope on the morning of the second Tuesday of May, 1819, the knot in the linen-room floor received no more of it that could be rendered into respectable English, Mrs. Tetlow having risen at that point, so she always maintained, of her own discretion, and shut the linen-room door, and wept into the second-best tablecloths with her daughter, the two of them holding each other like fools, said Mrs. Tetlow. For joy is a fool, and I hope I may be one again before I die. The betrothal was to the county what the comet had been to the almanacs. The dowager wrote from Bath a letter of 2 lines, being, dear Hugh, I said you would have to be worth marrying on your own account, and I am gratified to learn that you were. Bring her to me before the banns, for I intend to be insufferable about having seen it first. Mr. Hetherington, when the news reached Dogpole, is reported to have taken off his spectacles, looked at his clerk, and said, Mark this day, for the law of 3 counties is avenged. They have taken our best abstract, but she goes to the one house in England with a better muniment room than ours. And he came to the wedding in a new snuff-colored coat and cried in it. Mr. Raysbury received the intelligence with the observation that he had drawn the marriage settlement of a duke before, but never one in which he had been obliged to defend the lady's separate estate against the lady's own attempts to give it away. The settlement, as executed, kept Wistonhope to her and her heirs absolutely, secured her school with an endowment of £40 a year forever, and contained a covenant, inserted at the bridegroom's own instruction and read by Mr. Raysbury aloud at the signing with a face of perfect legal gravity, that the timber of the long wood should never be felled except for the repair of the hall, the cottages, or the church, the said covenant to bind the parties, their heirs and assigns, so long as the wood shall stand, which is why to this day there is a clause in a ducal settlement in the west of England that lawyers show one another as a curiosity, and why the oaks above Wistonhope are called, in the valley, the marriage trees. The banns were read at St. Milburga's on 3 Sundays running, by Mr. Haberley, whose voice shook on the first asking and steadied on the second, the parish holding its breath each time at the words, just impediment, as though Sir Goderic might rise through the pavement in a primrose waistcoat, and letting it out again in a warm rustle when nothing rose at all, and on the 3rd Sunday, when the curate closed his book and said, This is the 3rd time of asking. Old Speak was heard to say, in the Kynaston pew, in the loud flat whisper of the very deaf, Let him date that, whoever he be. And the congregation of Wistonhope laughed in church, all together, once, like a wave going over shingle, and the vicar of a neighboring parish who was assisting that day wrote in his diary that he had never before seen laughter improve a sacrament, and supposed it could only happen where a whole valley was of one mind. The visit to Bath was paid in June, between the 1st and 2nd askings, and deserves its page, for the dowager kept the promise of her letter to the syllable. She received them in her tall lodgings in the Royal Crescent, with the grey furs exchanged for grey silk, and the sharpness exchanged for nothing at all. She was insufferable for one entire dinner, as advertised, taking to herself the whole credit of the match, the discovery, and very nearly the Latin. And then, on the 2nd morning, she carried Theodosia off alone, in her chair to the pump room, on the pretext of the waters, and sat with her in a window over the steaming well, and was suddenly not sharp in any particular, and said, "My dear, I will say this once and in plain weave. I married the 4th Duke at 19 because 2 families had settled it over my head when I was in the cradle, and I was fortunate, for he was kind, and I learned to love him in about 11 years, which is quicker than many, and I buried him without one thing to reproach myself, except that I had never in my life chosen anything, not my husband, not my house, not so much as my own gowns, until I was 50 and past caring, and I promised myself at his graveside, in the middle of a bishop's very long prayer, that if ever I could help one woman of my family to a marriage that was chosen, freely, late, with the eyes open and the accounts read, I would count my books balanced. And I had given it up, my dear, for my son's generation married as I did, by treaty, and then Hugh writes to me that there is a lady in the Marches who kept him waiting 10 months and corrected his proposal for defective drafting before she took him. And I put down the letter, and I said out loud, in an empty room, in my mother's Welsh, which I have not otherwise spoken these 20 years, Diolch, which is, thanks be. And now you know why an old woman was rude to you over a pedigree at St. Stephen's, for I could not tell whether you were choosing him or the coronet until I saw you give up a winning position, because kindness was righter than winning. And no fortune hunter that ever sailed gives up the point, my dear. They cannot. It is how one knows them. Go home and marry my son, and tell your aunt, said the Dowager Duchess, rising and taking up her stick and her insufferability together, resuming both as one resumes a shawl, for I am told you tell her things at her stone, that Honoria Escourt is obliged to her for the last and best of her loans, and means, unlike some borrowers, to be worthy of the volume. They were married on the 14th of September, 1819, at St. Milburga's Church at Wiston Hope, at 10 in the morning, by Mr. Haberley, the vicar of the neighboring parish assisting, the Duke having asked, and the bride having agreed without 1 second's hesitation, that it should be the Valley's wedding, and not the county's, so that the coaches of the Lord Lieutenant and the member and the bishop stood that morning in a lane with hay carts, and inside the old church the Kynaston pews and every other pew held the estate entire, the tenants in their best broadcloth, the school children 2 rows deep at the front under Mrs. Tetlow's eye, the shepherd with his mended ankle, the miller who had floored the muniment room, old Speak upright as his ash stick in the place of honor, and the whole gathering smelling, as the dowager observed afterward with entire approval, of soap, lavender, and sheep, which, said she, is what a Christian county smells of, and the London churches may keep their scent. The bride wore a gown of dove-gray silk with a white lace at the throat that had been found, folded in silver paper with a docket in the upright narrow hand, in the 3rd drawer of the walnut press in the blue bedchamber. The docket reading, my mother's lace, worn by her at her wedding, and by no one since, there having been no wedding here. Let it wait. And she carried no flowers but a sprig of oak from the long wood, at her own wish, and on the way up the aisle, passing the 2nd pew, she stopped, before the whole church, and bent, and kissed the black-haired head of the carter's daughter Gwen, her goddaughter, who was holding up at her, gravely, at the full stretch of both arms, the worn marbled exercise book with the owl on the title page, it having been agreed between them, in the schoolroom, as a great secret, that the book should come to the wedding, since the aunts could not, and if there was a dry eye in the nave at that moment, it belonged to nobody who has any business in this history. They made their responses in the plain form, her voice as clear as it had been in Broad Street and his steadier than it had been in the library. The ring, which had been the dowager's mother's, went on. The registers were signed. The bride writing Theodosia Wynne for the last time and looking at the signature a moment, the way one looks from a ship at a coast, without regret, taking leave. And they came out of the south porch at 11 into the September sun, man and wife, Duke and Duchess, under a shout that went up the valley and came back off the Welsh ridge like a second congregation answering. And the bells of St. Milburga's rang one plain peal. And then, by an instruction the ringers had had from the Duchess a week before, and kept as the valley keeps things, which is absolutely, they rang it again, the second peal being, said the instruction, the one my great-aunt ordered and should have had, for she said she had had silence enough in her life. And my wedding shall pay her arrears. The wedding breakfast was held in the great barn that had held the harvest supper, all comers, 200 covers, the dowager on the bridegroom's right and Mrs. Tetlow, by the bride's absolute command, on the bride's left in a new black silk that rustled like October, and there were speeches, of which the county remembered 3. Mr. Raysbury, rising dry as ever, said that in the matter of Escourt and Wynne he had known the parties 1 year and 30 years respectively, that he had perused the settlement and found the title good, the covenants sound, and the consideration, gentlemen, the consideration beyond anything in his experience of conveyancing, and he drank to the consideration. Mr. Hetherington, in the new snuff-colored coat already shining about the eyes, said only that 9 years ago a young woman had come to his office offering Latin, and he had had the wit to say yes, and it was the one piece of business in his whole career on which he claimed no commission and expected, he thanked God, no discharge. And the Duke of Escourt, rising last, with his hand on the back of his wife's chair, looked down the steaming barn at the faces of her valley, and said, "Neighbors, I have made one speech this year that mattered, in her library, in May. She found a fault in the drafting, and mended it in 2 words. I have nothing to add to her amendment, and no man in England has." And he sat down, and the barn stamped and shouted as it had stamped at Michaelmas, and the fiddler's dog, wiser by a year, sat tight this time under the bride's chair, having concluded, like everyone else in the parish, that the safest place in any storm at Wiston Hope was next to the mistress. There was no wedding tour, or rather there was the shortest and best judged wedding tour in the annals of the peerage. They went away for 6 days, and they went to Oxford, where the Duke had not walked since his brother's death changed his life's whole grammar, and they lodged plainly, and walked the quadrangles in the September evenings among the new-come undergraduates, and stood together a long while in the library he had loved, under the painted ceiling, and he showed her the stair, and the window, and the corner where he had construed his first Horace at 17, and decided, in the way boys decide, that good sense and good temper were the whole of wisdom, and had then spent 20 years learning what the deciding costs. And she, who had never in her life seen the city her father's every anecdote had furnished, walked it, said the Duke long afterward, the way other brides walk Paris. And on the last evening, at the bookseller's by the North Gate, they bought for 4 shillings, after grave joint inspection of 7 copies, an 8vo Horace for Gwen, and the Duke wrote on the flyleaf, "From 2 friends of your godmother's friend," which was his first inscription as a married man, and the bookseller, having no notion whom he served, recommended the young couple to mind the binding. "For," said he, "a book handled daily wants a firm back, sir, the same as a marriage." And they went out into the lamplight much pleased with him, and with the age they lived in, and with themselves. The pattern of the married year settled by all saints into the shape it would keep. They would not give up either house, and did not try. The Duchess held that an estate without its family goes hollow in 10 years, quietly, from the church outward. And the Duke had seen enough hollow parishes to know it for sound doctrine, so the household moved with the seasons, Michaelmas to Candlemas at Wistonhope, for the school and the quarter days and the winter letters, Candlemas to Midsummer at Estcourt, for the assizes and the county and the great library, and the summer divided as the hay divided, and the 12 miles of river road between grew so worn with their comings and goings that the carters called it, without malice, the procession way. And a tenant of the Duke's, asked by a stranger at Ludlow Fair whether his landlord did not now live at Wistonhope, considered the matter fairly over his ale, and returned, "No, sir, I would not say lives. His Grace lodges at Estcourt, and lives wherever her Grace's inkstand is." In the first winter of the marriage, the great project was conceived. Over the 2 Horaces on the long table, on a night of sleet when the curtains were drawn close and the fire was banked high, and it was the Duke who conceived it, looking from the marbled exercise book to the paper-wrapped quire and back, and he said, "These should be printed." Not for the world. The world has Horace in English from better hands, or thinks it has, for the valley, and for the family, and for the plain reason that a work 3 generations in the doing ought not to depend on one damp attic or one careless air. There is a good press in Shrewsbury, 150 copies, the 2 texts page against page, the sisters on the left hand, you on the right, and the differences left standing, every one, for the differences are the story. And it shall be called, said the Duke, who had clearly been further into the knight's thought than he had admitted, the Wistonhope Horace, being the first book of the epistles done into English by 3 ladies of one house, with a preface saying no more than the truth, that the work was begun by 2 sisters in affection, continued by one in solitude, and finished by a third in neither. The Duchess was silent so long that he thought he had trespassed. But she was only gone where she went when things were too large for the room, and when she came back she said, on one condition, that the preface print the letter, my aunt's letter, the part that may be printed, the part about the wheel that turns by itself, and about the mercy of books. For if this book is to outlive us all, let it carry the warning with the cure, else it is only a curiosity. And she would scorn that, and so do I, and it was so agreed, and so done. All that winter, on the letter Sundays, the Duke sat on the other side of the library fire while his wife opened, one by one, in their order, the last of the 41. He did not read them, then or ever, holding them to be addressed, but he learned to know, by the set of her shoulders, which kind of evening it had been in the year 1700 and some odd down at the bottom of the page, and to have the tea sent in without asking on the hard ones, and on the Sunday after Christmas, at the last letter of all, written the autumn before the writer died, she read for a long time, and then folded it, and came and sat on the stool at his knee, a thing she did perhaps twice a year, and said, "It ends, and I am, as I was, your Deb, 40 one times she signed that Hugh, and it was true 40 one times, and no one ever read it, and I have been thinking what is to be done, for a correspondence should not end with silence on both sides, and I am the only pen left in the family, and what was done was this, that the Duchess of Estcourt wrote, that January, in her upright, narrow hand, a letter beginning, "My dear aunt," which took her 3 evenings, and in which she gave a full and orderly account, as to a correspondent abroad who had missed the news, of everything, the will, the reading of it at Dogpole, the house, the frost in April, the deed and its impossible queen, the frieze cloak on the hill, the 2 tables at Estcourt, the amendment in the library, the lace, the second peal, and ending, and so, madam, your side of the correspondence being now complete before me, and your letters being, I must tell you, the best I ever read in any hand, I close the account as you taught me to close all accounts, with the balance stated plainly, which is, that I had from you a hall, a fortune, a war, a husband, and a book, and that the greatest of these was none of them, but the finding that I had not, as I had all my life supposed, come of no one I am as I was not, but as I shall be always now, your loving niece. And she sealed it with the 3 seals in black wax, and carried it up the newel stair, and laid it in the iron-bound chest, on the top where the aunt's letter to her had lain. For the next reader, whoever and however far off she should be. For, as she said to her husband, coming down again with the keys, that chest has taught me how this family talks, Hio. We are slow, and we are shy, and we write better than we speak, but we answer. In the end, it took us 3 generations, but we answer. The Wiston Hope Horace came from the Shrewsbury Press in the first week of June, 1820, 150 copies in boards, a modest octavo with the owl of the Berry ink title page cut afresh for the frontispiece by an engraver in Birmingham, who wrote to say that in 30 years of trade he had been asked to engrave many things, but never before a schoolgirl's owl, and that he had given it his best pains, for the bird looked at him, sir, as though it would know if he scamped it. The preface was 7 pages, and said what has been said here. The letter stood in it entire from pride needs none to the mercy of them, and of the 150 copies, the first went where the whole parish knew it must. And on midsummer morning the Duke and Duchess of Escourt walked up alone through the churchyard grass to the flat stone that bore a name and 2 dates and nothing else, and laid the book upon it for the space of the morning service, with the church door open so that the psalms came out to it, and afterward that copy was placed in the parish chest of St. Milburga's, where it remains, entered in the inventory in Mr. Haberley's hand as item, 1 book of Horace his letters, Englished by the ladies of Wistonhope, the property of the parish forever, being the copy that went to church. Of the others, 1 went to the dowager, who read the preface, wrote Dialk on a card in Welsh, and sent the card to Wistonhope framed. 1 to Mr. Raysbury, docketed by him, it is said, Exhibit A in the matter of the education of attorneys. 1 to Mr. Hetherington, with a line from the Duchess, the account of Dogpoley with the county of Salop, stated and settled with the compliments of the right hand. 1 to the library at Christ Church, where it was catalogued by a young student of the college who is said to have remarked that, whoever the 3rd lady was, she construed like a scholar, and punctuated like an angel, a judgment which the Duke, hearing of it, had copied out and framed for his wife's writing table, where it hung as the only testimonial she ever suffered to be displayed, and 1 bound specially in green morocco with the owl stamped in gilt, was presented on the last day of the school year, before the whole kitchen school with Mrs. Tetlow and the household standing by, to Gwen the carter's daughter, aged 9, who received it with a curtsy she had practiced for a week, opened it at the frontispiece, looked a long time at the owl, and then up at her godmother, and delivered herself, in the hearing of the whole room, of the question she had plainly been storing throughout. Please your grace, when I have learned all my Latin, who will there be for me to write it to? And the Duchess of Escourt knelt down on the kitchen flags, regardless of her gown, and took the child's face in both her hands, and said, Write it to me, Gwen, always to me while I live, and after that, my darling, to the girl you will teach, for that is how the letters go on. They go on down. And Mrs. Tetlow said afterward to Prue, in the linen room, that she had seen the mistress win a lawsuit, a valley, and a duke, and had held up under all 3, but that the kitchen that morning had finished her entirely, and she was obliged to iron everything twice. In the September of that year, a 12-month after the wedding, the bells of St. Milburga's rang for the third time in this history, and rang longest, for on the 6th of September, at Wistanhope, in the blue bedchamber with the morning sun, the Duchess was brought to bed safely of a daughter. And 1 year and 1 month after the wedding, on the warm pale gold Sunday morning of the 15th of October, 1820, the child was christened at St. Milburga's by Mr. Haberley, the Dowager Duchess of Escourt standing godmother in grey silk with the air of a woman receiving arrears long owed her, and Mr. Raysbury, to his visible and carefully mastered astonishment, standing godfather at the Duke's particular request, it being, said the Duke, no more than justice that the man who had defended the child's inheritance before she existed should answer for her in church, and the names given her at the font were Deborah Alicia, which the parish heard with a sound that was not quite a murmur and not quite a sob, the two sisters being thus brought at last, as the vicar of the neighboring parish wrote that evening in his diary, into one name and one piece at one font, in the parish where they had learned their letters, and the entry in the register, which the Duchess wrote out fair herself at the vestry table, her husband and the two sponsors watching, in the upright narrow hand of her family, reads to this day, Deborah Alicia, daughter of Hugh, Duke of Escourt and of Theodosia his wife, born the 6th of September, baptized the 15th of October, 1820, and beneath it in the same hand, small and clear, 4 words in Latin, which Mr. Haberley, no great Latinist, asked leave to have rendered, and was told, it is from an old book of letters, sir, it says, love is not conquered, and if the register of St. Milburga's holds a completer sentence in either tongue, the parish has yet to find it. Of the years that followed this history, which set out only to tell how a will in Latin found its one right reader, must be content with the view from the Valley Road. The travelers who took that road in the 20s of the last century and asked at the mill or the smithy, as travelers do, whose hall that was above the water meadows with the great oaks behind it, got always the same answer, and got it with a particular note in the voice that made more than one stranger turn in the saddle for a second look. That is Wistanhope, sir. That is her Grace's own house, that her aunt left her, that read the false deed to pieces, and the wood behind is the marriage trees, that can never be felled while the church stands. It is in the settlement. And if the traveler had the fortune to pass on a fine morning in the school months, he might see, walking the lane from the hall gate to the church with a rook's parliament of children about her, a woman in a grey habit with no more state than a parson's wife, teaching, as she walked, by the ancient method of asking the questions herself and disputing the answers, so that the lane rang. And that, sir, the smith would say, wiping his hands, is the Duchess, and the black-haired one at her elbow that argues with her. That is the Carter's Gwen. That is to be a schoolmistress at the new school at Clunton at midsummer. The endowment being her Grace's, the first scholar the school ever finished, and the mistress do say, not the last, not by 50, and it was not by 50, nor by 100, for the kitchen school became in time the parish school, and the parish school seated 3 more down the valley and over the border, each one begun with £40 a year and a box of books from the Wistanhope Library, and each one opened, by unbudging custom, with the same first lesson given by the foundress herself while she lived, to the smallest children, sitting on whatever the room afforded, and the lesson was always the same lesson, how to write, in a fair hand, slowly, a letter to somebody far away, because she would tell them, and they remembered it gray-headed, A letter is the only bridge that a poor man's child and a rich man's child can build with the same stones. And I had a whole inheritance once from a lady I never met, and the bridge it came over was made of paper. And paper, my dears, if the hand is honest, holds. The Duke and Duchess of Estcourt were married 31 years. And the county, which had prophesied for the first 12 months that so bookish a match must end with 2 people reading in 2 wings, was obliged instead to watch, decade by decade, a marriage that wore like the oak it was signed under, and to fall back at last on the formula of the dowager, who, asked in her extreme old age by a granddaughter of the match what the secret of it had been, put down her cards, considered, and said, "They never once bored one another, child. It can be done. Marry your best correspondent." The 2 tables stand in the long gallery at Estcourt to this day, the width of a hearth apart. The Stanhope Horace was reprinted twice in the century, the second time with a memoir. The green morocco copy with the gilt owl lies now, by bequest of a very old schoolmistress who died at Clunton, full of years and scholars, back in the library at Stanhope, on the stand by the south window, beside a great church Bible, and the iron-bound chest in the muniment room, which is opened by each heir of that house once, alone, by a custom nobody now remembers beginning, holds at present, above the 41 letters and the 2 answers, a considerable correspondence in several generations of the upright narrow hand, the newest letters being written, the family admits, in ink nobody sells any more, by inheritors who could have telegraphed, and later telephoned, and did not, because the house had taught them what it teaches. And on a November evening in the year 1820, where this history takes its leave, the South Library at Stanhope held the following, in order as the firelight found them: a deep worn chair, and in it a duke, asleep at the 3rd chapter of a book on drainage, which subject he had maintained at dinner no man had ever finished awake. A cradle by the hearth, in it a daughter, 2 months old, asleep in the manner of her age, absolutely, with one fist above her head like a bell ringer, a stool, empty, close by the chair, and at the long table, in the ring of the working candles, a woman of 32 in a grey gown, not asleep, writing. She was finishing, as she finished each year now on this night, which was the 8th of November, the anniversary of nothing the calendar knew, the private ledger she had begun as a girl in 2 rooms over a stationer's shop, and the year's last entries in the upright narrow hand, unhurried, with the figures squared, ran thus: Item, rendered out of Latin for her grace the dowager. 1 disputed charter, no fee, the client being family. Item, taught in the kitchen school and the lane, 42 children their letters, of whom 1 to be schoolmistress at Clunton at midsummer, my Gwen, fee received in full, being the sight of her. Item, opened and answered, the correspondence of this house, all bridges in repair. Item, rendered into English for no fee, and for the last time entered under this head, the account being now closed and carried to the credit of those that begun it. 1 inheritance, to wit, a hall, a wood, a war, a book, a husband, a daughter, and a family, the whole received of Deborah Kynaston, spinster, per the mercy of books, and acknowledged this 8th of November with thanks, by her loving niece. There are stories that begin with a kiss, and stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with a knock at a schoolroom door, and with a letter from a dead man's glass house, and with a will read aloud in a Yorkshire schoolroom in the rain. And there are stories, longer in the making, 3 generations in the making, of the most patient kind the heart keeps, that begin with a line in a copyist's ledger, 6 shillings for 3 sheets of another family's Latin, and end where this one ends, in a firelit room in a border valley, with the drainage book slipping from a sleeping man's hand, and a child breathing in a cradle, and the November wind going over the marriage trees without finding one loose slate to trouble, and a woman ruling a line under a finished year in the hand her great-grandfather taught two sisters when King George II was young. The coal in the grate settled with the same soft sound it had made on the Friday she first read her own name in a dead woman's Latin. She looked a moment at the two sleepers, and at the two Horaces open on the table, the sisters' English and her own, side by side, page against page, where they would lie now always. The estate was hers, the peace was theirs, the letters would go on down. She closed the ledger and went up to bed.